Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spiritual Research Center here in Hamilton, Ontario. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a scholar, author, and musician. And I'm also a Noahide, which means I'm a non-Jew who follows the Law of Moses, or at least the parts of the Law of Moses that are relevant to me. Um, Now, for those of you who are new to my channel, you might be wondering, why would a non-Jew be following any part of Judaism? Like, what's up with that, right? And the short answer is that while part of me would love to be partying in nightclubs and doing tons of magic mushrooms and engaging in all kinds of fun activities, I can't get past the fact that Judaism is true. Okay? I can't crack it. The proofs are too strong, and therefore I have to accept that God exists, that there's some ground rules for my behavior, and that I can't be partying in nightclubs and doing all sorts of magic mushrooms. Okay? So what I'm going to be doing in this video is discussing one of the proofs that I can't crack, that I can't get past, and it is known as the Kuzari Principle. Okay? And as you see on the screen, the title of today's video is The Kuzari Principle, a Blockchain Proof for Judaism. So what I'm going to be attempting to convince you of in this video is that Judaism functions like a blockchain. Okay? And in much the same way that Bitcoin is super valuable because of the distributed mechanisms that, track Bitcoin, Judaism is also very reliable because of the way that it's constructed as a religion, and also the fact that you have a group of people who all believe the same thing and have believed the same thing for 3,300 years. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at how blockchain technology works. We're going to be comparing that to how Orthodox Judaism works. And then finally, I'll be sharing with you the Kuzari Principle, which is a philosophical proof for Judaism. Okay, and as you'll see, the Kuzari Principle really is just describing a blockchain, a human blockchain. Okay, so let's just jump into it. How does blockchain technology work? So if you Google this, you'll find that you're told blockchain is a shared digital ledger enabling the recording of transactions and the tracking of assets within a business network. Blockchain operates as a decentralized distributed database with data stored across multiple computers, making it resistant to tampering. Okay? So basically, blockchain is a technology where multiple computers all independently confirm the same data. It's very resistant to corruption because if you want to tamper with the Bitcoin ledger, you would need to corrupt 51% of the computers in the Bitcoin network. Okay? And for that reason, it's considered extremely reliable. Okay? If you're a hacker, maybe you could hack 10% of the computers, 20% of the computers. But if you want to hack Bitcoin or another blockchain, like Ethereum or whatever, you need to get to 51% of the computers, which is extremely difficult. And, up to this point, no one has hacked Bitcoin, which is why it's so valuable. Okay, so on the screen is a visual representation of how a distributed ledger works. What you have is a bunch of different nodes, different computers that are all tracking the same information, and they all kind of agree on the same thing. Okay? Now, as it turns out, Orthodox Judaism works in much the same way. Okay, so what you have with Orthodox Judaism is a group of people who all agree that they stood at the foot of a mountain and met God. Okay? You have a group of people that all agree that they stood at the foot of a mountain and met God. And this is actually different from other religions. Because with Christianity, yes, it started with Jesus, but really Christianity got going when Paul, the Apostle Paul, said that he had a vision on the road to Damascus, and this gave him spiritual authority. And if you look at the New Testament, most of it is actually stuff that Paul wrote. Okay, yes, there's some gospels that talk about what Jesus did, but most of Christianity really started with Paul. He kind of founded the religion. Similarly with Islam, you have the Prophet Muhammad who said, I met the angel Gabriel. Gabriel gave me the Quran, right? And everyone just kind of has to take his word for it. Okay? And even with like Mormonism, okay, you have Joseph Smith who says I think he said he met an angel in the mountains and discovered some tablets, and that kickstarted Mormonism. Buddhism, you have one guy, the Buddha, who said he sat under a tree and became enlightened, right? And discovered things about reality. And so everyone is kind of taking one person's word for it. Okay? Judaism is a little bit different. You have an entire nation of people that says that they stood at the foot of a mountain and met God. And that means they could turn to their neighbor and say, hey, did you just see what I saw? And they would say, yeah, I saw what you saw, right? So you have a whole nation of people, which is unique. It's called a collective revelation. A collective revelation. Okay? So on the screen, I've got a quote from a book called Pillars of Faith by Rabbi Pinchas Taylor. And this is what the quote says. Judaism is the lone faith that makes the claim of a national revelation where God appeared in front of the entire nation at one time. The Jewish people's assurance of the public revelation of the Torah is founded upon an unbroken tradition and pragmatic assessment of facts. The entire nation saw God reveal himself, give his instructions, and designate Moses as the conduit for recording his Torah. The Torah was dictated to Moses by God, and Moses wrote it down like a scribe writing dictation. Okay? So yes, in Judaism, you do have Moses who recorded the Torah. However, you also have this element of national revelation where everyone met God and they pointed to Moses and they said, you can read this in the book of Exodus. They said, this is too intense for us. Have this guy take point. Okay, that's what happened. Is they pointed to Moses, said like, you take this, like we can't take all this revelation, like you do it. But we all agree that we met God, and God's telling us that he's dictating to you, so we believe you. Okay, you don't have that in Christianity. You don't have that in Buddhism, Mormonism, and Islam. Okay, like if it was the case, for example, that Muhammad was in the middle of Mecca and everybody in Mecca met God and then said, hey, Muhammad can take point, right? Then you would have a national revelation. But that's not what we have. That's not what we have. We have a singular person who claims to have had some vision and received some things. No one can verify, and no one really elected him in the same way that the Jewish nation elected Moses. Okay? Now, when you look at how Judaism functions, it's very similar to a blockchain, except it's a human blockchain. The generation of Sinai passed down the knowledge to their kids, who passed it to their kids, who passed it to their kids. And ever since Sinai, the Jewish nation and Orthodox Judaism today, they've been continuing that unbroken tradition. It's a human blockchain. Yes, people die along the way because of old age, but you always have this collective nature of an entire group of people telling their children who tell their children. Okay? And we see this in Jewish texts like Pirkei Avot or Ethics of the Fathers. Okay? Moses received the Torah at Sinai, transmitted it to Joshua, to the elders to the prophets. And so in Pirkei Avot and other Jewish works, you find reference to this collective revelation that's been passed on through the generations. Okay? And Judaism is rather unique in that it can map out and has mapped out the chain of transmission from the Sinai generation onward. Okay, Judaism can actually map out and say, these are the names of the people that received this knowledge and passed it on. Okay, and in many cases, you know, I've heard actually of Jewish people having a book, like a personal family ledger, where they're able to trace back their lineage to certain people, right? Like there are descendants of King David alive today, for example, right? And anyone who, you know, has the last name Cohen, right? They descend from the priests, like Aaron, the priest. Okay, so there's an element of lineage here. There's an element of being able to track Judaism throughout time, which, in addition to the collective nature of the revelation, gives it validity. And the interesting thing about Orthodox Judaism in particular is that when you look at the structure of the documents in Orthodox Judaism, you find that the documents themselves have a lineage. Okay? Basically, in Orthodox Judaism, you can't really say anything or make up a law or whatever. You can't really do that unless you can trace the idea back all the way to the Torah at Sinai. Everything in Orthodox Judaism, the people and the ideas, has a lineage, and this lineage can be traced back 3,300 years. Okay? Now, one important thing to note is that anything that deviates from, you know, the chain of transmission is an illegitimate fork. Okay? In blockchain, you have a fork where people will like go off and do their own thing. Okay? And in the same way, there are a couple of illegitimate forks within Judaism that you know, confuse a lot of people. So I don't want to offend anybody necessarily, but conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism are illegitimate forks that originated in the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay? They decided that, like, okay, yeah, you guys have this chain of transmission, blah, blah, blah. We're going to go off and do our own thing, and we're going to call it Judaism. Okay? And unfortunately, it's not considered Judaism. Like Reform Judaism may have some of the trappings of Judaism, but it's not Judaism. They don't follow the chain of transmission. They don't respect the chain of transmission. They don't follow the laws and practices that have been instantiated. They're off doing their own thing and calling it Judaism. And the same for so-called conservative Judaism. Okay? The only legitimate fork of Judaism, the only legitimate form of Judaism, is Orthodox Judaism. Okay? So anyway, I hope this helped communicate that Judaism operates as a blockchain. You have a distributed collective ledger of the Sinai generation, and then they taught their children, and that generation became the distributed ledger, and then every generation of Orthodox Judaism since then has been a distributed collective ledger, okay, which is preserving the memory of Sinai. Okay. Now this brings us to the Kuzari Principle. Okay. I think, you know, for a lot of skeptics who are still watching, you might be wondering, how can we tell, or how can we know that this isn't just an ancient folktale, that some people just made it up and passed it on to their kids, right? And then it just became, you know, a snowball, right? How can we know that this wasn't just made up? In the description, I've linked a couple of videos which are extended explanations of why this can't be the case. However, the Kuzari Principle, which is from a book called the Kuzari, I think this will help explain it. So what I'm about to share with you is basically a philosophical proof. For any widespread historical belief, the belief is either true or was sold to the general public through deception. The historical belief in the national revelation at Sinai is widespread among the Jewish people, as is the belief that this knowledge has been passed down faithfully from generation to generation since the event itself. Given this, the Jewish belief in the revelation at Sinai is either true or was sold to them via some sort of deception. At no point in time could a whole nation have been deceived into the content of the story in question. Thus, the Jewish people would never have adopted the narrative in question unless all of their parents had already told them the story. At no point would the Jewish nation have bought the lie that millions of their forebears witnessed something and that it was faithfully passed down from generation to generation, unless all or most of the parents of their generation had already told them, and unless the nation was already a sizable nation. Okay? So we'll pause here for a second. Imagine if I came to you and said, you aren't allowed to eat bacon. You aren't allowed to eat cheeseburgers. You have to observe all of these holidays and so on. You have to pray 3 times a day. You have to do all of these things. And why? Because your grandparents met God. Your grandparents met God. You would immediately come to me and say, my grandparents never told me any of this. How can you say my grandparents met God? Okay? That's kind of what's going on with the Jewish nation. Okay? Because imagine, let's say there's a bunch of ancient Jews sitting around a campfire, and someone comes up to them and says, hey guys, we aren't allowed to eat bacon. We can't have cheeseburgers. We have to wrap tefillin. We have to pray 3 times a day. We have to follow all these customs and so on because your grandparents met God. Okay? The ancient Jews sitting around the campfire would immediately say, my grandparents have told me no such thing. You're crazy. Okay? So it's functionally impossible to have this kind of narrative injected into the consciousness of a people because it precisely relies on the fact that there's an ancestral component to it. No one is going to buy into this story, especially given how good bacon is. Right? Who is going to give up bacon over something that their grandparents apparently experienced that they never told them about? Right? It doesn't make any sense. Okay? And the videos that I've included in the description kind of go into this in detail. Okay? Anyway, let's move on with the Kuzari Principle. Given this, the widespread belief among the Jewish people in the story of the Revelation could not have been spread by deception. And finally, given these realities, the widespread belief among the Jewish people in the story of the Revelation must be true. The same argument will work for the story of the Exodus of Egypt. Now, the cool thing is that the Exodus from Egypt, we actually have the proofs for it and the archaeological evidence. I'm working on, an extended video that demonstrates, hopefully indisputably, that the Exodus from Egypt happened. Okay? There's a lot of archaeological evidence for the Exodus from Egypt. There are some major problems with the Egyptian dynastic chronology, and those problems are now being recognized by modern Egyptologists. So the Exodus from Egypt actually has even more proof. But when it comes to the collective nature of the revelation at Sinai and the way it's been passed from generation to generation, what the Kuzari Principle is demonstrating is that it would have been impossible to inject this kind of belief into a national consciousness. Okay? So, yeah, that's the Kuzari Principle. Essentially, what we're looking at is a human blockchain. You have distributed ledgers in the form of millions of people who stood at the foot of a mountain and witnessed something. Okay? The next generation became the next generation of distributed ledgers, and so on and so on. And so the Jewish nation, in some ways, is like a human blockchain that has preserved the memory of Sinai for 3,300 years.